Welcome everyone to CG webinar and CG seminar number 163. We think it's around about number 40 in our webinar series. And today's topic is the bibliometric output of academic publications from post-Soviet countries. Not nearly enough discussion of this very large zone of human activity, the post-Soviet zone, in higher education and research studies. We're only now, I think, beginning to give the sort of fuller attention to the region that it deserves. Very large populations, very large numbers of institutions and scientific establishments at work. And the record of publications, not as well known as it should be, because much of what happens in the post-Soviet zone happens in languages other than English and doesn't become part of the common pool of global knowledge. But there's a great deal more research and scholarship than Web of Science and Scopus really realise. And I think today we'll get some sense of this vast pool of new knowledge and information which is coming forward, and its potential in the future to develop and grow. We have with us Maia Chankseliani, one of my colleagues at Oxford, most valued colleague, and Andrey Lovakov, who's online with us from High School of Economics in Moscow. Maia will do, I think, the substantial part of the presentation, and both of our presenters, our speakers, will take part in the discussion. Let me introduce Maia, but first of all, perhaps Trevor, we should move to the webinar protocols. Please note that the webinar is being recorded. And the recording will be posted in the next 48 hours or so. So your words of wisdom will be there for all time. Also, the chat, which is the other kind of words of wisdom which you can express during the webinar, will also be posted within the next 48 hours or so. Now, when we move to the substantive discussion, we advise you to use speaker view, which is in the top right-hand corner, so that you can see who's speaking at the time. Please keep yourself muted and turn off your camera until you're asked to ask a question, in which case you most definitely turn on your microphone and turn on your camera. The procedure we use for questions is as follows. We advise you to put your question in the chat. That way we can identify you, we can bring you into the discussion. It's a good idea to start thinking about your questions during the substantial presentation, and to not leave it to the last 5-10 minutes of the webinar, because questions that are asked by about 1:30, if they're on the, 2:30, if they're on the topic of the webinar, will get asked in the session. Questions that appear at 10 to 3, no matter how relevant or interesting they might be, will tend to miss out. So come in early. At this stage, it's a pleasure to invite in Maia Chankseliani. Maia is Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education at the University of Oxford, where she leads the teaching program in that area. Maia is active in a number of research domains related to international and comparative studies, not only of higher education, but of tertiary education in general. She's worked on a number of external projects and consultancies, and in relation to UK government agencies, such as the British Council. She's also worked with the World Bank, Qatar Foundation, UNICEF, European Commission, and others. So someone who knows a lot about development aspects of education and higher education, and already, I think, a formidable expert in our field. We welcome Maia, and we look forward to what you have to say today.
Thank you very much, Simon, for your kind introduction. Let me try to share my webinar slides. I hope it's shared now. Okay. I hope you see the slides. If someone could confirm, great, excellent. So today's webinar is about global knowledge creation, and to a certain extent it continues the conversation that Simon started on Tuesday's CG webinar that some of you might have attended. Now, the world's largest community of scientists disintegrated in the period following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the first country to build an atomic power plant, to launch the artificial satellite, and to send the first human into space. The Soviet research community was part of an enormous, I would say, centralized machinery of the Soviet science. This machinery did not recognize academic freedom, was quite centralized, highly politicized, and entirely state-driven. Soviet Union was the world leader in selected disciplines in terms of research, such as physics and mathematics, seismology, metallurgy, chemistry, among others. Similar to other countries where collaborative imperative has dominated the hard disciplines as we know it, the military and space research projects in the Soviet Union were undertaken by large teams of scientists. Yet, these mega collaborations were unlike mega collaborations in other countries, as we know them. A key characteristic of the Soviet research was its 7-decade-long isolation from international influences. Soviet citizens were rarely allowed to travel abroad. Therefore, the opportunities of international collaborations were extremely limited. Another characteristic of the Soviet science was an unequal distribution of the research activity across the Soviet Union. The largest number and the most important Soviet research projects were undertaken in the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. Russian Federation subsequently became the legal heir of the Soviet Union, and it inherited quite a big proportion of the Soviet scientific infrastructure. All in all, the former Soviet countries had a number of common characteristics in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union dissolved. The 15 former Soviet countries chose quite divergent paths of economic, social, and political development. When it comes to higher education and research, policy discourses in these countries emphasize everything global. They emphasize global norms, global reputation, global competitiveness. Global is becoming a condition, we can say, in which individuals, universities and other institutions and the whole countries aspire to operate. Yet, as you will see here, the investments in research and development are not aligned with these aspirations. You see here the indicator which is called the global gross domestic expenditure on research and development, GERD. Now, GERD ranges between 0.1 and 0.13, well, 0.10 to be more precise, and 0.13 of GDP in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. In contrast, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, and Russia allocate between 0.61 and 1% to research and development. Estonia, as you can see, is the largest spender in terms of the proportion of GDP, 1.43%. Probably you'll be interested in how these figures compare with other countries. For instance, Israel and South Korea invest almost 5% of their GDP in research and development. China invests 2.2, USA 2.8. Okay, so then these two figures basically showed some information on the research productivity per how many articles are published per 100 research and development personnel across the former Soviet countries. You see that overall the productivity is quite low. Okay, and the next one is about the increase of the research output when we compare the output in 2019 to 1993, and you see that the output has increased dramatically for Lithuania, for example, and remained almost the same for Turkmenistan. I'm slightly cautious that if I get lost again, whether you will hear me or not. So this is the slide on the areas, subject areas, and we see that natural sciences are extremely popular. Okay. However, the popularity of natural sciences has been decreasing in the last few years, and instead we see increases in the popularity of medical and health sciences, agricultural sciences, and humanities. Okay. Let me move on to the authorship data now. The absolute majority of publications from these countries are co-authored. Co-authored publications include smaller co-authorships of 2 to 5 individuals, larger co-authorships of 6 to 20 individuals, and mega collaborations with 21 plus authors. All countries included in the analysis have a larger share of mega collaborations, as you can see from this slide, than the world average, which is 0.4%. Armenia and Georgia are noteworthy in this regard, as 24% of research output from Armenia and 21% from Georgia are authored by mega teams of more than 21 researchers. Now, substantial proportions of co-authored publications emerge from international collaborations. The larger the number of authors, the more likely the publication is to have at least one author from another country. The practice of international co-authorship is markedly more widespread in this region than globally. In fact, every former Soviet country has a higher proportion of internationally co-authored publications than the world average of 27%. The single country where the proportion of internationally co-authored publications is relatively small, yet larger than the global average, is Russia. And we think there are potentially 3 possible explanations for this. First, researchers in Russia may be less likely to seek collaborations abroad due to the large number of research and development personnel at home. Our analysis shows that the former Soviet countries with more research and development personnel tend to have smaller proportions of internationally co-authored publications. The number of research and development personnel actually are positively correlated with the GERD per researcher, gross spending on research and development per researcher, and this leads me to the second potential explanation of Russia's relatively low engagement in international research collaborations. With the highest GERD per researcher in the region, Russian scholars may be less likely to seek international collaborations for the purpose of accessing the international research funding. The literature recognizes that the access to research funding can be quite a potent driver for international collaborations. Finally, there exists a number of Russian language journals, almost in all major disciplines, where Russian scholars can publish. Now, quality of journals. As an indicator of the quality of the research output, the study uses the quartile ranking of journals in which outputs are published. Journals indexed in the Web of Science are divided into 4 quartiles. The division is based on the journal impact factor. The quality decreases as we move from quartile 1 to quartile 4. Contrary to intuition, within each area of study, there are different numbers of journals in each quartile. This is because the journal rank is based on the journal's impact factor and how the impact factor compares to other journals within the same area of study. For journals indexed in the arts and humanities citation index, the impact factor is not calculated, as impact factor is considered to be a poor reflection of quality in arts and humanities. Now look at this. Our analysis shows that while the differences by country are large, the former Soviet countries taken together have produced output published in considerably lower quality journals than the world average. In the period of 1993 to 2019, 43% of the global research output was published in quartile 1 journals, the best journals. This is a significantly larger proportion than the average for the majority of countries included in this study. Estonia has produced the largest proportion of high quality, and the smallest proportion of lower quality output. In contrast, Tajikistan appears to have the lowest proportion of Q1 publications and the larger share of Q4 publications. The former Soviet countries with smaller proportions of publications in Q1 journals tend to have larger shares of publications in Q4 journals. Georgia and Armenia have produced exceptionally high quality output and are closest to the world average with around 4 in 10 publications in Q1 journals. One way to explain this high representation in Q1 journals of publications from Armenia and Georgia is to look at the authorship patterns of articles published in Q1 journals. The publications with larger numbers of authors are more likely to be found in Q1 journals than publications with fewer authors across all former Soviet countries. The fact that some countries, notably Armenia and Georgia, have larger proportions of articles emerging from mega collaborations can offer one possible explanation for the relatively high representation of publications from these countries in Q1 journals. In contrast, single-authored articles are less likely to be found in Q1 journals. Tajikistan, Russia, and Azerbaijan, which have large proportions of output from solo research, are relatively overrepresented in Q4 journals. Now, the examination of the quality of output by the area of study adds more nuance to the broader patterns presented here. Since the majority of the publications from these countries are in natural sciences, the distribution of natural science publications in Q1 to Q4 journals closely resembles the distribution of the publications in the entire dataset that you see on this slide. Estonia, Georgia, and Armenia have particularly large proportions of natural science publications in Q1 journals, while Tajikistan, Russia, and Uzbekistan have the smallest proportions of natural science publications in Q1 journals. On the other hand, while engineering and technology takes up a large share of publications from the region, 21%, the quality of the output appears to be below the world average. An unusual pattern was detected here in terms of the discrepancy between the interest in the area of engineering and technology and the quality of the output. Two countries with the strongest interest, Ukraine and Belarus, with almost 1 in 3 publications in engineering and technology, have 1/3 of their engineering and technology publications in the lowest quartile journals. The leader in producing the largest proportion of engineering and technology publications in Q1 journals is Estonia. In social sciences, Georgia has the largest proportion, 40% of Q1 publications. This is followed by Armenia, with 36% of publications in the top journals. In contrast, Ukraine and Russia have only 14% and 17% of all their social science publications in the top journals. Let me now move to our third indicator, which is impact. As an indicator of impact of the research output, our study used the number of times each publication is cited, irrespective of which journal it is published in. The indicators of impact and quality in our study, you may notice, rest on the same measure, the citations. One pertains to the publication, which was quality that I presented, and another to the venue of publication, and is a sign of meeting specific standards of quality expressed by the journal impact factor. This study uses the following 2 indicators of impact: category normalized citation impact, that you may know as CNCI, and the proportion of publications in the top 10% of the most cited publications. Both indicators are normalized by the area of study, by the year of publication, and the publication type. The average impact of publications for the last 3 decades from the majority of these countries is below the world average for the same period. The publications from 4 countries, Kyrgyzstan, Estonia, Georgia, and Armenia, that you see at the top, have impact ratings higher than the world average of 1, while Armenia Armenia, Estonia, and Georgia show a steady increase in the CNCI. Kyrgyzstan, we see, had larger spikes in CNCI in 2017, which is driven by a dozen of papers written by big medical collaborations. The publications from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Russia, and Ukraine have particularly low impact ratings when compared to the world average. Another indicator of impact that we used in the study is the proportion of publications included in the top 10 of the world's most cited publications. A small group of the former Soviet countries, Estonia, Georgia, and Armenia, have been overperforming in terms of having more than 10% of their publications in the world's top 10% of most impactful publications. While Estonia had a relatively steady increase of the proportion of publications in the top 10% in the last few years, Armenian and Georgian statistics show more fluctuation. One possible explanation for the overrepresentation of publications from these countries, especially Armenia and Georgia, can be the exceptionally high proportions of 21 plus authored mega collaborations in these countries. Saying that the examination of the authorship patterns of top 10% of most impactful articles shows that very large shares of the top 10% of most impactful publications from this region, as you can see from this slide, have 21 plus authors. Compare this with the world average of 2%. And now see that 81% of the most impactful publications from Armenia and 65% from Georgia emerge from mega collaborations. I will jump this and present some of the concluding thoughts. So there has been some criticism, of course, of bibliometric methods, arguing that such analysis further disadvantage peripheral countries and reinforce asymmetries in the process of global knowledge creation. While we recognize the unequal footing of many researchers and of many research institutions from this region, our study has offered some empirical evidence on the existence of large variations within this region in terms of how much these countries have prioritized research, the amount of research output each country has produced, as well as the quality and impact of the output. Our analysis demonstrates that former Soviet countries that spend more per researcher have larger numbers of researchers. More researchers tend to produce more publications, and the spending per researcher is linked with the country's investment in research and development as a percentage of their GDP. Thus, countries that prioritize research have more researchers and more publications. Yet, this is where the links between the characteristics of the output and the research funding seem to end. This study found that none of the three measures of the national spending on research, GERD as a percentage of GDP, GERD per researcher, or GERD per capita, is linked with the quality or impact indicators of the research output. We have shown that the former Soviet countries are not key players on the global research scene, as they cumulatively produce about 3% of the global research output in the Web of Science database that we analyzed. At the same time, our findings demonstrate that researchers in the former Soviet countries tap into international collaboration networks quite actively. Large shares of internationally co-authored articles indicate that many of these countries have researchers who are attracted to international collaborators. This finding is also a demonstration of the integration of researchers and institutions producing research into global networks, and it's to be viewed in the historical context of the Soviet research being known as one of the least collaborative globally. All in all, this study represents the first attempt of mapping the research activity across the former Soviet countries to confirm that while the output may be modest, in the last 30 years, researchers in the majority of these countries have continued engaging in research and contributing to the global knowledge creation. The future studies on the potential determinants of the differences that we highlighted in this talk will need probably to examine the research output in relation to the variations in the national policies, variations in the institutional practices, and of course, variations in the individual expertise, motivation, and opportunity. Thank you, and I apologize again profusely for having so many interruptions because of the internet. Let me stop sharing and start video.
Well done, Maia. I mean, we really did get through it successfully. You spoke so well that you held us, I think, even despite the problem of the connection. And, you know, it's just a fact of life. These things can happen. But I think the data were all there and your explanation was very crystal clear. So you've given people already quite a bit to talk about in the chat. You'd like, I guess, the discussion to go to the fundamental issues about causes and you know, meanings and so on and interpretation. But inevitably, we're going to need to talk a bit about the data and how we initially understand the comparisons and so on. The research world, you could say, is divided into three groups, broadly speaking. There's the people for whom English is a native tongue and who are fully fluent in the language and therefore able to fully access and take part in the global conversation. Then there's people who, and some countries have this characteristic, where they're normally bilingual in English and their own language. You could say much of Western Europe's now like that. And there's an ease, you know, people from Germany, Holland and so on, Switzerland move very easily into that English language global literature. And you're getting that competence to some extent also in East Asia too. And, you know, you get, but it's much less, say, present in Latin America or Central Asia. So then there's a third category of people who work with global English because it's where most of the knowledge is that they need to access is found, but, you know, have a reading and competence rather than a full fluency in terms of writing and speaking and listening. And for them, they prefer to talk to their colleagues about scientific matters in their own language, naturally. Now, when I did interviews in 2013 in Moscow in research organizations, I discovered that, and something which you no doubt know, that what happens in many cases is that in Russia is that stuff comes in from the international literature in English and it gets translated, and then people work with it in Russian. So you got a big industry involved in, and I think this goes back to Soviet times, you know, translating material into Russian rather than directly reading it in English. I went to MISES, which is a very good engineering university. You know, it's often ranked. It's on the sort of edges of the top 5 in 100 project. And in MISES, they told me that there was a great deal of work they did which appeared only in Russian and never reached English. And it was mostly practical stuff about engineering research that related to industry in Russia. So there's clearly a body of work which is outside the English language conversation and which comes into the comparison. But of course, we don't know how much there is of it because by the nature of a kind of grey area like that, we don't have a clear definition. How would we go about tackling this problem in research-wise, given that the great databases we work with, which are so explanatory in so many ways, don't uncover this problem for us? How can we get at it?
Very good question, Simon. Very pragmatic question too. How to solve this issue. Well, just to give slightly more detail, there are a number of journals included in the Web of Science and included in our analysis that are in other languages such as Russian, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and Estonian. Most of them, Andrey would probably also confirm. We have discussed this issue quite a bit because, as I said, also Vladimir is also very much interested, is very knowledgeable on the publications and Russian publications in particular. He recently shared with me really detailed information on the numbers of journals published in Russian, numbers of journals actually, some of which are published actually in Russian and others also published in English. Some of them are translated into English, others are actually published in Russia in English, etc., etc. So there are various mutations of these languages. So publishing in vernacular languages, publishing in English, and publishing translations. Sometimes publishing only abstract translations of abstracts. Now also, sometimes cases when journals are published, for example, in Russian, but in another country, in another former Soviet country. So there are various permutations, as I said. How to move forward? I think we need to have separate studies also to include all journals that are published in this entire region or published in specific countries, and see the knowledge production patterns in local languages, and also knowledge production patterns in local languages plus English language. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we chose to focus only on the knowledge in the global domain in this study, and that's why we chose Web of Science data. But we understand that this is a limited proportion of the knowledge that is produced in this country, research and scientific knowledge that is produced more broadly. This is not perhaps fully reflective of that knowledge, but this is the knowledge from these countries that reached and penetrated the global domain, and that's why it's quite interesting to look at this proportion. We do not know even what proportion of the entire knowledge this represents, but we know that it represents only 3% of the knowledge in the global domain.
Yes, and I think that...
Sorry, I do not have a clear answer.
The whole question, no, it was good. And the whole question of what is part of the global conversation is an important issue, because if the other knowledge is separate from the global domain, that's an important fact and a limitation in itself. At the same time, what that means is the WOS type database isn't an absolute valuation of knowledge or an absolute final word on what is or is not produced. And in that sense, the comparative aspect has to be handled carefully, as you have just done. But you know, the question of who's in and out of the global knowledge bank, crucial issue, really, I think, and it's a regret, isn't it, that after, you know, as you said, the beginning, you know, the importance of Russian science or Soviet science, but it was never properly connected, and it didn't feed into the larger conversation and improve science elsewhere. And this is still the case in a sense where we've got a lot of research not feeding into the larger conversation, not contributing to it, not connecting to it, and that, I think, diminishes all of us to some extent, that lack of connection. We've got a number of questions coming up, and Emma Zaleva, who presented for us very ably a few weeks ago, is going to be our first questioner. Emma, can you come in at this point? Hello, Emma.
Yeah, hi, good morning from Toronto. Thanks, Maia and team, and a really great presentation. You managed very well despite the awkward issues. Don't worry about those. It's so nice to see such an interesting and big group here. I'm afraid I don't have any, you know, super interesting questions along the lines that Simon was suggesting we should, but I do have a technical question, I guess a more technical question. So I'm quite interested in the journals which are often produced by universities in the former Soviet space. So the Vestnik, Izvestia, those kind. And I've noticed a trend in some places for those to be indexed in different countries' indexes. And I wondered whether in your global search you noticed or were looking to see what kind of journals were beginning to appear. I'm particularly interested to see whether there's been any trends with these university journals coming into being featured in Web of Science, and if there's anything that you could speak to about that.
Thank you, Emma. Very important question, and especially linked with our big project with HSC that looks at the university research capacity development. I am not quite sure how many of these journals that are indexed in Web of Science are necessarily university-based, but I would like to ask Andrey if he has an idea, if he noticed any patterns or saw any journals that are university-based.
If you know the Web of Science core collection, they create some new indexes which called emergent size citation index, and this kind of index is this kind of journals you mentioned, like Vestnik, Izvestia, and something like this. Some of them are now indexed in Web of Science, but in the special separate indices which called emergent size citation index. And there are some question about the quality of these journals. And now, in our case, in case of our study, we didn't use the papers from this special index, and there is a low probability that this kind of papers from these journals are in our sample of countries' papers. But yes, now this kind of journals become more open to the global community. At least they can find them, the title and abstract, and see them. But we don't use these papers in our study.
Simon, you are muted.
My sincere apologies. Kuat Akisanov, can you come in, please? Your question. Kuat.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. I didn't expect that I will be provided the floor. So thank you, Maia, for your presentation. It's really interesting. There's so many talks about, the contribution of, form of or Eurasian scholars into this global studies. So I kind of expressed some doubts about the numbers and where they come from, especially, and of course, this is not to undermine the really critical situation with the science and how much, what are the expenditures of the state and how much we published. But anyway, like Kazakhstan is the only country which has, for the last 2 decades, this state-run program. And apart from master's degree graduates, we also have PhD graduates for the last 15 years. So 90% of them at least publish one article. I know that some of them already have a lot, kind of building this community of a doctorate, PhD graduates with a PhD degree from Western universities and who publish in English. So I'm kind of surprised that given the size of, for example, Armenia and Georgia, and the size of where these numbers come from, and at least I didn't come across any data sources. So can you please explain? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Excellent. Thank you, Kuat. I can actually show you another slide now of the increase of the increases in the publications in the Web of Science from each country. But before I do that, let me explain again. Sorry, maybe I was interrupted when I was talking about it because of internet. So all of this comes from the Web of Science, which is one of the largest global databases as it's declared, of most reputable journals. Okay, so together with, for example, Scopus and Web of Science are recognized to be 2 global databases of journals. Now, this is where the data comes from. Okay, we analyzed all publications from these countries in the Web of Science database. Now, to give you more detail and to show you how Kazakhstani publications actually started a steep climb following 2012, and I think that was very close when Kazakhstan introduced requirements for publications for DPhils as well. I can share very quickly one slide with you, and you can see the differences by country, and you can see also other countries there. Let me do it quickly. Okay, so here is, if you can see it. So this is the data for each of these countries. And you may see Kazakhstan right here. Look what happened in Kazakhstan in starting from 2012. Other countries have relatively, for example, Armenia, Estonia, Georgia, Lithuania have a relatively more stable increase in their publications, as you can see, right? Why Armenia and Georgia are doing better in terms of the quality, that's a much bigger thing. And that one of the hypotheses that we try to indicate to is that Armenia and Georgia have very large proportions of mega collaborations, 21+ authored publications. And we think that potentially that is what drives the quality and impact of publications from those very small countries that also do not invest much in research. There are fewer questions about Estonia because Estonia also invests much more and has much larger capacity.
Thanks, Maia, and thank you, Stuart. Can we bring in John Anker at this point?
Thank you, Simon, and thank you to the presenter. Very interesting presentation. I'm just wondering from the data whether you've established whether or not there's any relationship between research quality as you've measured it and the percentage of research undertaken in universities, or the counterfactual, the percentage undertaken in research institutes.
Good question. Thank you, John. I am personally very interested in that. We have not yet fully finished the analysis in which we're attributing each of the country authors to the institutions in which they're based. We have almost finished the university-based author part, but other institutions like research institutes, government agencies are not fully done. So we have not done any additional analysis to correlate those things. But from what I have shown to you, the data at the moment shows that, for example, the largest proportion of publications, 70% of Web of Science publications from Estonia, Georgia, Lithuania, Kazakhstan, and Latvia are produced at universities. So these 5 countries seem to have strengthened their universities, and universities are capable of producing much more and higher quality research, right? Whereas if we look at Armenia, Uzbekistan, Moldova, and Russia, only 30 to 40% of Web of Science publications from these countries are from university-based authors. Now, very difficult to talk about correlation because, for example, Georgia is in the first group, Armenia is another group, but we see that Georgia and Armenia both have quite high quality, high impact publications. So very tricky to say now, but we hope to do more on this after we finish fully connection of authors with different types of institutions, which is quite a meticulous task.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Heurelio Hamadov has a question, but he's asked me to ask it on his behalf. It's quite a short question. It goes as follows. Is it possible to track the publications in the so-called predator publications?
Okay, very good question, very important question. We chose Web of Science. One of the reasons that we chose Web of Science is that Web of Science does not seem to have predator, so-called predator publications included in it. It's highly controlled, selective. In the literature, it's called authority control. So Web of Science access authority control is highly selective. So it's unlikely, highly unlikely that any of these publications is in a predatory journal. But of course, it will be quite interesting to study those practices and those journals. I know one of my colleagues, David Mills, is very interested in this topic. And he's doing some work on Africa.
I think we can fit in Sharifa Zhurabeva. Would you like to come in with your question, Sharifa?
Sure. Do you mind if I don't show up myself? I just had a quick question. Maybe it's a big question. I was wondering if there is any relationship between the number of research publications from the former Soviet Union countries and the level of democracy in the country. I know that in some countries it's a little bit hard to conduct research, like you have to get the permission of the government, permission after permissions. So I was just wondering about it. Thank you. It was a great presentation. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharifa. Thank you. We have not done such an analysis, although probably I would like to do such an analysis considering my previous research interest and topics that I've published on. I see Simon is smiling. I do not think, even if there is such correlation, probably it would be slightly spurious because there is no theoretical hypothesis why, for example, countries that are more democratic would necessarily produce more or higher quality publications than non-democratic. So I do not think there is any strong hypothesis behind that. So if there is a correlation, it may be just random just may happen to be so. But I think it's quite interesting to see publications by discipline and to look at, for example, social science publications. And as we have seen, if you go back to some of those slides, we see that some of the countries that may have slightly more democratic traditions lately may have slightly more social science publications and more impactful and higher quality social science publications. I think that there we may see some link, but to talk about the overall research output, I think that may be slightly problematic.
Isn't that a great topic though? I mean, it's like it's a webinar and in itself. And I mean, the relationship between political culture and academic productivity and creativity. It's I guess that the complicating factor is the autonomy of the academic world, and you can have an autonomous academic community within a more authoritarian political culture. That's clear. I mean, you can see that around the world now that there are some non-democracies that produce a lot of science, for example. Harder to imagine them producing a lot of critical social science because it gets into the political cultural realm directly then and challenges the state. But it is possible to have that kind of space between the political culture and the academic world. But the question of how much autonomy there is in the academic world is itself a political cultural problem, is itself a political question. And by no means all centralized top-down regimes will tolerate or will welcome an autonomous academic environment. So in that situation, there's a more direct relationship, isn't there? But not all democracies handle academic work the same way either. So you get some variety, you know, in the relationship with any political type of political culture. But I do think there is something there, some causal factor, and there's also ways in which it's not directly causal. So it's very much worth a proper discussion because we make judgments about this without thinking, I think, and we need to sort of, it's an important issue. We need to explore it. I want to thank you, Maia. I think that was a great job in the circumstance. And, you know, I think everyone really liked the webinar and the presentation. So you should be really pleased with it. But clearly there's curiosity and interest in the topic, and we'll have more discussion. We'll have more discussion in a couple of webinars' time on post-Soviet research productivity and production, and I'm sure we'll keep talking about the region in the future. Next Tuesday we have the UK and the pandemic in higher education. So having looked at the pandemic in quite a number of global regional contexts now, we're now going to bring it back home for us and look at the UK. Look at the situation of the higher education sector struggling to deal with the pandemic on campus, but at the same time operating almost as normally. So in the middle of the chaos, people are going on regardless and teaching, learning, living and laughing or complaining and sighing, as the case may be. And perhaps in that sense, the UK has more in common with Russia than either country would probably be prepared to admit. You know, this ability to go on business as normal amid the sort of environmental chaos. But we'll talk about that. I think it'll be a very interesting and entertaining webinar with our 3 speakers next week. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again, Maia. Bye for now, everyone.